What's going on, everybody? I'm Jay, the Reformed Puerto Rican dude. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight, I've actually got my friend William Clark, who needs no introduction. Excuse me. How's it going, William?
Good, good to be here. Thanks for having me, Jay.
Good to have you, man. Uh, Before we get started, guys, I just want to let you know what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about preterism. And if you're wondering what that is, stick around. We're going to go over it. But, Bill, real quick, before we get started, why don't you kind of give a really, really quick rundown of who you are, kind of like how you came to faith. Um,
Sure.
you've been here before, so it's not like you should be a surprise for most people, but maybe like a 1 minute quick introduction.
Sure, yeah. So, former pagan, as most people are, was saved in my 20s, um, and had sort of a Damascus Road moment. Went on to study theology and scripture in depth, learning original languages as well as the art of exegesis and preaching. I am a former pastor at a congregation that is now unfortunately defunct because of a split, but I am a happy member and congregant of a new church, Cornerstone church in near Decula and Winder, Georgia, in the Jefferson area under Bobby Linkus, a great pastor, but still continuing my studies to this day. Theology is a passion of mine, and I also, my more prestigious title is Modmin for Wasawak and a few other reform groups online, as well as meme lord over some tag groups that I have created as well. So that is of course the greater of the of all of those accomplishments. So in all seriousness, it's great to be here, and I'm glad to share this stage with you, Jim.
Yeah, man, definitely glad to have you. This is what your second or third? I'm pretty sure it's your
Third,
third time. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
So, and we're gonna have you again soon. Hopefully, if we can coordinate. I won't say too much, but yeah, I think you're gonna be a regular here. I'm gonna make you an honorary Puerto Rican. I think I told you
All
that
right.
once or twice before. I've told Jake I gotta make you guys. There's got to be a badge or something. I feel
Can
like
we
the other
can we
Puerto Ricans.
can we still
Yeah,
say the word Boricua, or is that now offensive? I don't know if
that's
that's
not
offensive.
offensive.
I'm
That
gonna
is
get
not
it. I'll just
offensive.
get it tattooed backwards on my head, so when we're on here, it'll be the right way.
That's funny, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, I'm happy to have you here, and I am definitely happy to have you as one of the mod mints on Wasted Whack. By the way, if you're watching, you don't know what Wasted Whack is. That is, wait a second. This is wholesome, actually Christian content. It's a group on Facebook that myself and a couple other dudes, including Bill here, run. It's an interesting group. So if you're on Facebook, I won't say too much. I won't ruin the surprises for you. Chukrudu, I call him
Yeah.
Chuck.
Yeah. Chuck. Jeez.
Bill knows who I'm talking about. He's been fun lately.
He's been on a tear, man. It's wild, man. It's wild.
He does this every once in a while, but never in our group to this extent. So
He
just
needs
some
like
trolls we have in there.
he needs a job or a wife. I don't know what. I don't know what's
So,
going on.
so get this, okay? This is for real. In real life, so myself, Will Smith, and a former admin, well, I guess I'll, out of respect for him, I won't say his name, but three of us basically know what his name is in real life, and he is for a fact married with a kid.
Oh, amazing,
Yeah, that is quite shocking,
amazing!
right?
I'm surprised.
I mean, well, I
God
would be
bless
too,
that.
man.
God bless that woman. That
Yep,
is
yep.
that's great.
He
That's
he
great.
actually is Nigerian, like for real though, but that's not his real name. But out of respect for him, we don't talk about his real name. Anyway, so let's get back to the theme that we're actually going to be talking about. So preterism. So if you guys are watching and you kind of heard this word thrown around, full preterism, partial preterism. I'm sure you've heard of all that. Let's start with the basics. So, Bill, what is preterism?
So preterism really is a term that comes from root praetor, which means past, right? Or really something that has ended, or it's that's sort of a past is sort of a gloss, right? There's obviously a couple of meanings, but they all point towards things that have already been completed or things that have happened in the past. Okay. And so preterism, especially with regards to theology and biblical interpretation, has a lot to do with prophecy as it relates to the end times, right? And which of those prophecies have been fulfilled, which have not, and those that have been fulfilled, right? When were they fulfilled? Were they fulfilled in the past, or are there things that we should look for in the future? And preterism says that there are definitely prophetic items that have been fulfilled in the past already, right? And we should be taking our look at the eschaton and the movement towards the second coming of Christ, with those things in mind, and starting from the point beyond those fulfillments, right, instead of before them. So now there are, multiple types of preterism, but that's the basic definition, right? It's looking at interpretation that states that prophecies have been fulfilled in the past that have to do with sort of the eschaton itself.
Okay. And so, you and I both know, as well as probably most of the people that are watching, that that doesn't really seem to be the most common view when it comes to eschatology, right? The study of
Not
last things.
nowadays. It certainly was at one point in history.
Right. Right. Exactly. And so, you know, what would well, I don't know if we want to get into the different types of understandings, right? The different types of views. But what would you say is the name of the most popular one today? And why do you think it might be a little bit problematic?
The most popular eschatology today is without a doubt dispensational premillennialism. And it is problematic not because of the premillennial aspect, right? There's a historic view on that that's orthodox, but the the problematic portion of dispensationalism is the attempt to cut up portions of the covenant and its laws and its commands, as well as the covenants themselves, in a way that doesn't really fit how Scripture lays out what covenant means, from Noah to Jesus, right? And so the problematic part is that you have bizarre teachings that sort of come out of this dispensational model, um, that do things like forbid people from evangelizing because that dispensation is over. Matthew 28 is for the apostles only. This kind of bizarre interpretation comes along because people are attempting to try to make their interpretation consistent, even though that doesn't necessarily fit the order and command of Scripture. So that's one example, right? The other example, the bigger example, right, would be the view that there are two peoples of God,
Hmm.
right? That there's ethnic Israel, and then there is the church, right, which somehow includes ethnic Israel, but is not doesn't is not ethnic Israel. Um, but that there are two peoples of God. That is a peoples that are saved by His choosing, through the Mosaic covenant, and that covenant continues and will be renewed, and that there is a secondary way of salvation for the people of ethnic Israel, right, as
Right.
compared to the way of salvation provided for the church, in the new covenant. And so, obviously, that gives rise to numerous um, interpretive problems, as well as
Yeah.
sort of heretical cults that have come out of that, like Hebrew roots movements um, and things like that. And in fact, the what's interesting is the Black Hebrew Israelites, which is a major cult, are
Hmm.
extremely dispensational. That's where they get their that's where they get a lot of their misinformation. So um, so there can be a lot of interpretive problems, and that's not to say there can't be interpretive problems with other views, but that is the most popular view. Modern dispensational premillennialism really was popularized by John Nelson Darby,
Hmm.
and later, like the Ryries and folks like that, through their study Bibles, in a time when study Bibles were not really a thing, right? So the first
Right.
one that
Yeah.
really got put out, um,
Schofield.
yeah, Schofield and things like this, that all those
Hmm.
popular Bibles that got put out were written from a dispensational perspective. And so that's what everyone was exposed to for a long period of time, for the last 150 years.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm actually trying to. I'm trying to figure out like what would you say is the main difference between preterism and the most popular eschatological view, which is dispe premill,
Yeah,
in terms of their understanding of prophecy and their timing, right?
yeah.
Specifically when it comes to the book of Revelation, because we've
So
already kind of established that preterism, at the very least, says that some of Revelation has already occurred. But
right.
what is the dispensational view when it comes to Revelation?
Yeah, so the dispensational view and really the premillennial view, right, for the most part, is what we would refer to as futurism. That one's pretty easy to figure out the origin of, right?
Sure.
Um, and so, whereas you have preterism that looks to things that have already come to pass, in regards to John's revelation, as well as some of Jesus' prophecies in the Gospels, um, there's this view that um, the interpretation that's that sort of grammatical historical approach, right, requires literalism around some of those prophecies in Revelation and from Jesus. And so, for example, in Matthew 24, when a futurist reads that the sun's not going to give its light, the moon's not going to give its light, stars are going to fall from the sky. Well, they go outside, they look up, and they go, "Well, that hasn't happened yet."
Hmm.
So clearly, that's meant for the future, right? So
Yeah.
the main difference is the literality and the woodenness of the reading, right, of those prophecies from Jesus and John's apocalypse, of course, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I definitely, actually, now that you mention it, you mentioned Matthew 24. So we're gonna have to, at some point in this discussion, hopefully, if we have time, go through at least a portion of Matthew 24, because I think there's a lot there that we could talk about. But let's leave that for the end. So if anybody's listening to this and wants to kind of take a look at the preterist understanding of Matthew 24, stick around till the end. For the time being, let's focus back on preterism. So, okay, we've kind of determined what preterism is, what it's essentially its nemesis, we could say, is in futurism, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And premillennialism. But there is a distinction even within preterism itself, right? So
Correct.
there are, you kind of, I think you already mentioned it, that there are different kinds of preterist views.
Yeah.
Specifically, what I'm referring to is the partial preterist and the full preterist view. So,
Yeah.
can you flesh that out a little bit? What is a partial preterist? What is a full preterist? And what's the
Yeah.
main difference?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm going to step on some toes here. I hope that's okay. Um,
Always,
I know we tend to
always.
do that a little bit, but we really have to here because there is an important distinction to be made. So, um, a a full preterist out of the gate believes that all eschatological prophecy has occurred in the including the second coming of Christ and the establishment of the new heavens and the new earth in finality. That is heresy.
Yes.
It's nothing short of it. That is a damnable lie. In I'm sorry to step on anybody's toes who is a hyper preterist or a full preterist, but you are if you are in that camp, you are deceived. Um, Christ's second coming and the establishment of the new heavens and the new earth is an act of redemption that heretofore has been unseen since that time in any manner. Okay. So we want to make sure that we're not talking about the finality of the redemption of the heavens and the earth and all of Christ's people. That is full preterism. That's the idea that we are beyond the written eschaton in Scripture, that we have reached the final stage.
That all
Um,
prophecies have come to pass.
all prophecies have come to pass, every single one. And that is, I mean, you're going to have a really hard time. reading that consistently into the scripture, right? And so I think again, full preterism is the sort of the opposite extreme of that really extreme dispensationalism, right?
Hmm.
Which is the attempt to stay consistent with a hermeneutic, um, but not being willing to concede that hermeneutics change from passage to passage and book to book depending on the intention of the
Yeah.
author, right,
Right.
in those books and passages, right? And so that's an attempt to just sort of just the same way that the extreme dispensationalists do it. These full preterists do that as well. They say, well, no, that's the interpretation, so therefore everything is past. There is no room for historicity or futurism. There's none of that, because we want to be as consistent as we possibly can be. The problem is both positions lack consideration. And the consideration they lack is that the author's intent matters in every passage. And so there is an interpretive approach to the scripture, which is the correct one, right? That takes each set of passages into consideration based on what the author is trying to get across, using their grammar and word choice as well as their sentence structure and form.
Hmm. Hmm. So, what would you say is primarily the difference? Because it sounds like you really went into detail about full preterism, um, clearly outside of orthodoxy, right?
Yeah,
Like clearly outside of orthodoxy. But what is it about partial preterism that can fit within orthodoxy and still hold to that position of this has to be weird for people who are watching, especially hearing about this for the first time, like really,
yeah,
like the prophecies have been fulfilled, and like how does that even work? And so
right.
so how does that fit into the mold of orthodoxy, I guess, is my question.
Well, it fits in the mold of orthodoxy because there are prophecies that we can point to a historical fulfillment of, right, with demonstrable evidence that fulfillment has occurred. However, we are we are taking the prophecies and applying them only where there has been demonstrable historical fulfillment, right? And taking the other prophetic writings as they are written and intended, which is for the future, right? So that's called partial preterism, right? We touched on that earlier. So when we look at partial preterism, we're looking at um, an attempt to make sense of the text based on the way that the authors wrote it at the time, and then based on things that came to pass pretty soon after those writings occurred, that are sort of demonstrable fulfillments of those prophecies. We don't want what we're not doing is just going, well, we're just assuming this because it was written this way, right? Instead, what we're saying is, well, it's written this way, and is there something we can point to that seems to indicate that this prophecy has been fulfilled, or that it matches another prophecy that has been fulfilled, or is tied to the Old Testament prophecies about the same thing, right?
Right. Right.
So it is called partial because we only partially believe that certain prophecies have been fulfilled with regards to the eschaton.
Right. And like I said, I definitely want to get into examples of that
Yeah.
a little bit later on with Matthew 24 and things like that. But for the time being, so why would you say full preterism is problematic? What's the biggest issue here?
Well, so full preterism is extremely problematic because if those prophecies have come to pass and been fulfilled, there is literally no reason for the commission of the Lord to evangelize people. Um,
Mm,
that the fullness of the church has come in, right? That's a prophecy that would have been fulfilled. Okay, and so what you have in hyper preterist camps is the belief that many people who say they are saved are not. Now we hold that belief as well for different reasons, right? Um, but that there is no hope. That they believe that there is a false church and a true church, and that the true church is already come in its fullness, and this is how things are going to go from now on. Everybody's basically going to die off, and only the saints will remain, and that will be sort of the new heavens and the new earth. They believe Jesus has come back and established that sort of new heavens and new earth kingdom in finality. And so there is no sort of glorious return of Christ to claim his kingdom. There is none of that. And that the problem with that is that, one, it doesn't match what scripture states about the nature of Christ's return, right?
Hmm.
Um, and two, it takes the faith and makes it inert with regards to evangelism and the saving of souls.
Yeah.
It's a very frustrating ordeal because it frustrates the missional mind, right, of a Christian
Hmm.
when you say, well, there's really nothing I can do, you know. And in that way, it's actually very similar to the escapism that we find in extreme dispensationalist camps as well. We're just going to keep our nose clean and let God do his thing and try to get out of here before things get too bad, right?
Right.
Is the other side. So,
Yeah. You know, partial or full preterism, I should say, is something that I probably think about once in a while. Once in a while, I'll see like somebody who is a full preterist online or something like that. And it just makes me every time that I see somebody like that. Again, it's not a lot, but I see them once in a while. I think about things like the resurrection, for example. Like if
right.
everything is fulfilled, so Jesus was resurrected physically, right? He had a physical body. We know this. He had Thomas touch his wounds. He ate breakfast with Peter and some of the other guys over there. When when they were fishing. So he had a physical, real body. But then what do they do with the resurrection of the dead? Like that's
Well,
that's one of the things that
yeah,
I've thought about.
I mean, they believe that the resurrection of the dead has occurred. Um,
Sure, but
yeah,
I'm assuming that they believe that it's that spiritual, being
right.
born again resurrection. Um,
Correct.
but
Correct.
that would be spiritual, but not physical, right? But the promise is still
Yeah.
physical.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. The promise is corporeal for sure. And they do not believe that in any sense, right?
sure.
Um, because according to the full preterist view, this is it. This is it. What we have is this is it. This is all.
So
It
so and
also
yeah,
removes from um, the totality of scripture and theology the idea of a final heavens and earth that is eternal in truth, right?
right,
Meaning
right,
it's eternal in experience, experientially eternal. um Instead, what it does is leave us at the place of Abraham's bosom and Tartarus and Sheol,
right,
Abaddon,
right.
right? That's it. That's all there will ever be, right? Is Abraham's bosom, what we call that intermediate state. Most people
Hmm.
refer to it as the intermediate state. Um, and then, of course, Tartarus. Now, they do believe that the lake of fire has formed and that people are being thrown in there now, that Satan has been bound and thrown in there, that death has been bound and thrown in there, the judgment has occurred. All of these things have occurred, and that this is just sort of it, right?
That's but that's crazy to me because like even I mean they die. You know what I mean? Like whether you're a
Correct.
full preterist or anybody, you die. I mean,
Yeah.
uh,
And in
that's
their
that's
minds,
wild.
that intermediate state, right, is the final state.
Okay. I mean, oh man. I don't know if it would be a good idea to have a full preterist on the show at some point or not. That would be something. I would definitely love to hear how they get around all the problems that
Yeah.
seem to pop up. And I'm not trying to. They're obviously heretics. They're not within orthodoxy. I'm not, but even so, I'm not trying to misrepresent their view, right? Just like I wouldn't
No,
misrepresent a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness. It
sure.
just seems to me that, like, these types of people, and again, I could be wrong because I haven't had a full on conversation with a full preterist. I've only read a couple things, seen some comments online. Um, but it just seems to me that these type of people usually just kind of like move the goalposts. Every time
Yeah.
you say, okay, well, look, this is a problem, deal with it
Correct.
head on. It's kind of like, well, look over here. They want to change
Yeah.
the subject. They want to move the goalpost and talk about something else. I'm not saying that's what will happen, but
Right.
based on experience, seems like that's what may happen. Okay, so let's go ahead and then go back to partial preterism, right?
Okay.
So how would you say that we can know? How are some ways that we can know that the partial preterist view is the correct view, in your opinion?
Well, I think we have to look at it really all comes from hermeneutic, right? There's an established structure to reading scripture that has to do with prophetic utterings and writings, poetry, history books, teaching epistles, these kind of things. We have all these categories in hermeneutics that determine sort of the way that you read a passage. Okay, any passage, any book, any given book, it's the intention of the author is going to largely determine how you read the book and the prophecies. Um, so one of the things that we can look at across scripture is that common language in prophecy is used from Genesis to Revelation. Okay. Um, Revelation to a lot of people can sound very fantastical
Yeah.
if they have not read the prophet Isaiah and the prophet Jeremiah and the prophet Ezekiel, for example. When you read them, Revelation doesn't sound too fantastical. Not really, right? In fact, it all sounds extremely similar.
Mm,
And there are parallels, right? There are parallels. The four living creatures and the four beasts and these kind of things. There's all kinds of parallels between the Old Testament and New Testament with prophetic language. And if we're to look at the Bible as one unfolding scroll, right, we have to have a consistent hermeneutic across the board. And so one way we can look and see, well, does partial preterism hold any water? Is does the prophetic language match up? Does it seem to indicate, right, that certain prophetic phrases, certain prophetic utterings seem to mean one thing across scripture? Do they match, right?
hmm
um, and the other piece is we have historical events that match as well, right? So we were talking about Matthew 24, but one of the passages that I want to discuss is in Second Thessalonians.
Okay.
It's
Sure.
the man of perdition, right? So when you go, Bill, how can you read that passage and say that has already come to pass, or the man of perdition is Nero, right? Which I believe. Um, well, the reason I can do that is because I can look at history and I can read that passage in the historical context and go, what is it that's being talked about here? Well, in Second Thessalonians, there's the phrasing, the falling away, a falling away, right? People go, well, it's a falling away. The word is apostasia, right? So where we get apostasy from. Um, and they automatically assume that because the word apostasia is used, it must have a religious context to it, but
hmm
it doesn't. Apostasia is any revolt, any kind of rebellion, any kind of turning away. And Josephus, the historian, would tell us that these passages and passages written around that time were likely referring to the Jewish apostasy from Rome, the
Mm.
revolt that was happening at that time.
That's
And that
interesting.
and that
So,
there
so
would
I'm
be, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just want to clarify. So when we talk about apostasy, we use it in the, I guess you could say, religious context.
Right.
But in the original language, it wasn't necessarily attached specifically to that, or uniquely to that. You would say that this was
Correct.
just a general word that was used for revolt or rebellion. Is that
Correct.
correct? Did I?
That's right.
That's
So when we think about definitions of terms, we're using glosses. So when you look in a concordance, you have like three or four different definitions that a word can have depending on
hmm
its usage and the surrounding grammar and context. It's important that we don't take one gloss and go, that's the only use and meaning, right? And that's what
Right. Right.
happens with apostasy. There is such a thing as spiritual apostasy. We know that, right? And
Sure.
there are portions of scripture that talk about that. However, in this case, the usage of the term is pretty general. It doesn't really seem to indicate a spiritual apostasy in the text. So I think Josephus has the right of it in stating that this is likely referring to that Jewish revolt against Rome that then
Hmm.
was sort of the catalyst for all of the unfolding events from Nero's time to Vespasian and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And then, of course, that would mean in that case that given the timeline laid out in Second Thessalonians, that nobody but Nero could be the man of perdition, right? Because
Sure.
it's this man that it's that rebound effect that happens because of that sort of apostasy or falling away as it's translated in Second Thessalonians. And so we have a historic event that points to this kind of thing coming to pass. So we can look and say, well, that makes sense logistically, right? If we look at it, we can say, well, there definitely was a Jewish revolt against Rome, and there
Hmm.
was a
Right.
hard reaction, right, back on that. The killing of, I mean, an innumerable amount of Jewish people, right,
Hmm.
in Israel and in Palestine at that time, um, and by Nero, right, and later by Vespasian, Titus, if you will, as well. And so when you look at that, you go, well, that seems to have already passed, right?
Hmm.
That seems to have already passed, and so it's no longer a sort of a problem passage because we're looking at it in a sane sort of historical way, right? And a lot of
Right.
people will say, well, you don't want to go outside the Bible for part of your interpretation. Well, historically and contextually, you absolutely do want to do that because the Bible verifies history,
Yeah.
okay? Um,
Absolutely.
we're not saying history verifies the Bible; it's the other way around.
Right.
The
Right.
Bible states that history is playing out in a certain way, and history itself is verified by those biblical writings. And this is just an example where we can look and say, well, yeah, that definitely verifies how things were going at the time, and it also verifies the urgency with which the letter is written. Right?
Hmm.
It seems really bizarre to take a long-term approach with a letter that uses grammar that seems to give a sense of immediacy, right, to
Yeah.
those kind of things.
I wanna actually pull up Second Thessalonians. Is there a particular chapter that we should be maybe looking to?
Yeah. So well, I don't,
I'll
I
pull it
don't.
up on the screen. I don't know if you have. If not, I mean, we don't have to,
Yeah,
but
no,
I'm just
totally.
curious to read it for anybody that's watching. We
Yeah,
can kind
absolutely.
of
So we can go to if you want to just pull up chapter 2, that's fine.
chapter two.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's about 11 verses, so it's pretty long passage.
Okay. All right.
Um,
We'll do as much as we can. Let me go ahead and pull it up,
yeah,
and let me know if you can. Oh, hang on. What happened there? There we go. Should be able to see it, right? You can see
yeah,
it from your end.
I
Perfect.
can. Yeah, absolutely. So you're using the ESV, which I'm glad for. Um,
Okay. I can switch it if you
so
want.
no, that's perfect. Because I'm using a Nestle Allen, so that it aligns right with it, right? Um, so I think the better word choice here is picked, right? You can see in verse 3, it says, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first." There's no falling away,
Mm, that is
right? This is
interesting.
just a general rebellion. And
Yeah.
what happens after the rebellion? Well, the man of lawlessness is revealed, or the man of perdition, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God.
Huh.
Okay. So this is sort of when we look at that, we go, there's an action and there's a result, right? So a rebellion happens, and this man of lawlessness is revealed, and he exalts himself in this way. Those of us that are familiar with history would understand that the proclamation of Kaiser Kurios through the course of
Yes.
history and its importance, right, in Roman culture reached its peak with Nero, right?
Yeah.
In fact,
Yeah.
if you didn't say Kaiser Kurios, you couldn't. You couldn't buy, you couldn't sell, you couldn't enter certain forums, and you could actually be jailed or killed
By the
for
way,
such an offense. Yeah.
I think we need to, for the non-Greek speaking viewers, what is Kaiser
Oh, I'm
Curios?
sorry. Kaiser Kurios means Caesar is Lord.
Okay.
Means Caesar is Lord. And so this was a statement that was made into almost a mandatory greeting betwixt people in the Roman Empire at its peak, right? Which is when Nero is sort of going insane, right? Which this seems to refer to, his sort of descent into his final madness, right? Declaring himself
Mhm.
to be God, and all these kinds of things, setting himself up as God. And then, of course, with its culmination of Vespasian coming to Jerusalem and doing all manner of horrendous, horrible things, including coming into the temple of God and declaring that Caesar is indeed God, right?
Ooh,
Um, and so there
that's what
are,
I was thinking about. Yeah.
yeah, there are, these are really, this is a really logical progression of events that we can see unfolding in an immediacy of history during that time. Okay. um so that's, to me, there is no interpretive problem with the passage,
Yeah.
right? To me, that makes as much sense as anything could possibly make, right? Because it
Yeah.
lays it out exactly as it should. And I think the word rebellion, the word choice there is better in the ESV because it removes an unnecessary spiritual context to the
Hmm.
to the apostasy that's stated to happen at that time. And then that, given that it's a general rebellion grammatically, seems to match up with the history of the time.
Yeah. It's interesting because I hold to a partial preterist view for um uh, I was primarily convinced because of other passages, right? Not so much Second
Sure.
Thessalonians. I mean, maybe I went through it at some point, but it's one of those things where, like, just kind of, you say, "Hey, that sounds about right to me," and then just kind of flies over your head. Like, if I'm making a case for partial preterism, I wouldn't go there. But that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, the
I'm
the
actually
reason I
surprised I
use it
didn't.
the reason I use it is because it's often cited as a problem passage for partial
Hmm.
preterism.
Yeah,
But
and it's not.
that's an example how you can take a sane look at it and say, well, is it really problematic? Not really. If I'm going to be totally honest, Matthew 24 is the most convincing text
Right.
for
Yeah.
partial preterism in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
John's
I would
apocalypse is,
actually
yeah,
use Matthew 24 and Revelation. I used to shy
yeah,
away from Revelation so much, man.
yeah. No,
It was terrifying for me.
it's funny because I think, we talk about this all the time, but I think, G.K. Chesterton sort of said it best, right? That John saw many fantastical beasts and monsters in his vision, none of which were as fantastical as his commentators. So that, it really
That's
is,
funny.
there really is a vast spectrum of interpretive approaches, right, that can make John's revelation seem really terrifying, right?
Yeah.
The reality is that it's actually quite plainly written. It's quite plainly written. It's even in the name. When we think about the apocalypsis, of John, right? We think the word apocalypse. It actually means to reveal the something, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so it's, I think Bonson did a good job with this. He says, look, it's the revelation of John, not the secrets of John,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's meant to give you something that is very easy to understand, things that are being revealed in a clear way, right? And so I think that's, for me, you're right. I think Matthew 24 and Revelation are very convincing texts, and especially the first few chapters of Revelation are extremely convincing from a partial preterist standpoint.
For sure. For sure. All right. So, um, I guess the next logical question then would be, um, you know, what would you say are some of the more common objections against partial preterism, or honestly preterism in general, right? We don't have to limit it to just
Yeah,
partial, but I mean, I guess we'll have to do partial preterism because we have objections against full preterism. So,
sure.
let's just say this: what are some of the objections against partial preterism, and how can we respond to those objections?
Yeah, I mean, I think the primary objection comes from the well, it's the approach to apocalyptic literature as
Hmm.
opposed to the traditional grammatical historical approach to prophecy, right? Um, and then it's the disagreement between grammatical, historical, and Christological readings of the text. Okay, so um, those who hold to a grammatical historical reading typically will literalize and woodenize the prophecies from Jesus and those in Revelation, right? Um, but for and so what their objection is that we're not reading it literally. We're not
Right.
taking it as it's written. The problem, right? That we would the thing that we would sort of say back is actually you're not taking it as written, right? And we can
Right.
demonstrate that when we go to Matthew 24. We'll demonstrate an example of that. But the main objection is that what they see on the page seems to describe things that cannot possibly have come to pass because of the language, the naming conventions, the Hebraisms that are present that they may not understand, the colloquialisms at the time. Um, there are several things like that that they look and they go, well, I don't know about any of the colloquialisms, the Hebraisms, any of that stuff. What I see on the page is XYZ, and we should interpret it as XYZ, right? We should
Sure.
not. And so that is um, their their argument is if we're doing sola scriptura, right, we should take this as written as an individual book and set of passages. Our argument would be we need to take it in regards to tota scriptura and
Yeah.
how it
Exactly.
compares to the rest of scripture. Now, I'm not accusing them of not comparing it to the rest of scripture, but what I'm saying is they have created a different category of hermeneutic for those specific passages
Right.
and writings, right?
Right.
Whereas we would say, well, we're going to take sort of the traditional approach to reading those prophecies.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you could say, I talked about this in an earlier video, but you can say, listen, that hyper literal understanding of Scripture is part of the reason why the Jews missed their Messiah,
Correct.
because
Yeah.
they expected a very, very literal conqueror and king,
Right.
and when you go back and you read those prophecies and you see that symbolic language, right? Speaking
Yeah.
about a literal king, right? Because Jesus is a literal king, but not in the way they expected.
Right.
um you miss the Messiah, and so now I feel like this hyper literal wooden interpretation of Scripture, you're kind of making the same mistake again, right? You're
Yeah.
putting some things in the future that didn't happen the first time that the Jews were expecting, right? It didn't go down the way they wanted it to. Jesus didn't come to, like, conquer Jerusalem and take it away from the Romans and be
Right.
uh, their king, right? Sitting literally on the throne in Jerusalem at that time.
Right.
And so they say, well, that's all going to happen in the millennial kingdom.
Right.
So they're like, because it didn't happen the first time, but the Jews had it right. It's just it didn't happen at that time.
Yeah.
And but then you run into, anyway. I'm going off on a tangent here. So oh my goodness, I forgot what I was going to ask you now.
No
All
worries.
right, so we were talking about um the remind me, what was it that we were talking about? We were talking about how to read Revelation
The well,
because
we were talking about the objections to partial preterism, right?
yeah, 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 yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. And so that really is the primary objection is literality versus sort of a more traditional metaphoric reading of those prophecies. And that
Right.
really is that's the split. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, when it comes to that, right? When you get those kinds of arguments, what do you usually say to a person that's bringing that argumentation?
Well, I would ask them, what is the standard for literality in their hermeneutic, and where else does it appear in the scripture?
Right.
And the reason I ask that is because the hermeneutic for reading scripture was established with the Old Testament. You don't actually need another hermeneutic um,
Sure.
approach. You,
Yeah.
you really don't, right?
Right.
Um, because it covers all forms of written scripture. In fact, you have so many different forms of written scripture and so many manners of interpretation that are appropriate for those books and passages. That when you look at the New Testament, you go, actually, this is quite simple. There's not really
Yeah.
a whole lot of that variety compared to the Old Testament, and so that kind of hermeneutic is is already established. And I would say, well, if if your hermeneutic is consistent, where does it occur in the Old Testament with regards to literality and that kind of prophecy, right? Because
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
would say, from my perspective, I can point to dozens of prophecies that fall into sort of the other category, right?
Yeah.
Of metaphoric reading and decreation language and its purpose and all these kinds of things. So, um, I think that's the first question I would ask is, why are we interpreting this literally, right? But something similar in the Old Testament metaphorically,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
What's the indicator? Like
Yeah.
grammatically, contextually, what's the indicator in the writing that says we need to interpret it this way, right? And
Yeah.
and and I think what we would find is it's going to be really hard to find sort of a reading of wooden literality. I don't want to say that we don't take the Bible literally, but what I do want to say is that woodenness, that hyper literality, right?
Right.
Where that if Jesus says, "I'm the door," we're looking for a knob and hinges. I mean, it
Yeah.
just is,
Yeah.
there is that kind of hyper literality. And
Yeah.
why do we apply it to something um, like uh, like Revelation, like the Revelation of John, or
Well, but
um,
that's the thing. They make that distinction sometimes though. Like they don't literally believe that there's going to be a beast coming out of the sea. Like the beast of
some of them do.
Revelation. Well,
Some of them do.
most dispensationalists I know, and listen, we have great dispensational brothers in the Lord, as well
Absolutely,
as premillennials, not
of
just
course,
dispensational
of
premillennials, but
course,
historic premillennials as well.
yeah,
Um, but what I'm trying to say is like when it comes to things like numbers, right? For example, the millennial kingdom, 1,000 years.
yeah,
That can't be a really long period of time for them. That has to be a literal 1,000 years. But then you
correct,
take the beast of Revelation and you say, well, that's not a literal beast.
right,
And so it's kind of like what you're alluding to, like are you just picking and choosing? Like when do you know
yeah.
it's literal? When do you know
When
it's not?
when's the grammatical change happen?
Right.
Because it
Right.
doesn't seem to indicate any of that. It's written pretty straight. In fact, the Revelation of John is written with a kind of grammatical perspicuity that is undeniable. It is meant to be clear. It's written in a
Sure.
way that's meant to be clear. One of the funniest passages in that regard to me, I always chuckle when I see it, is when John freaks out and he goes, "I don't know what any of this means." And the angel goes, "I'm about to tell you, settle down," right? Like, he's like, "Chill out. I'm literally about to tell you what's going on." And so even in his experience of of these visions, right, there is a an approach to it that says there's going to be clarity. This should not be unclear, right? This we should not remove the perspicuity of this text for the sake of fantastical interpretation, right?
Right. Right.
Instead, we should go, oh, this text is very, very clear. And when people say things like, well, Laodicea is the church in America. No, it isn't. It's actually the church in Laodicea. Um,
Yeah.
and
Right.
that much is clear. There is no, it's not written to mean anything like that, right?
Mhm.
However, there are pieces of the text that are written sarcastically, right? That use Hebraisms and colloquialisms, things like referring to Jerusalem as Babylon. This was a common thing. Okay. This was a common thing. So there are portions of the text where you look at it and you go, well, that's a clear metaphor, or that's sort of an epithet, right, for a place, right, or a
Hmm.
people's, or a situation, or whatever, that seems to cast a negative light on it, you know. We don't have time to really probably talk about it now, but how about 666?
Right.
It's an epithet. It's a Hebraism.
Right.
Hebrew people reading that would know what that meant. And so it's, and it would be very clear. There's no fuzziness to any of that. And so my challenge to people reading the scripture and interpreting would be that, given that's the case, it certainly seems like God expects you to perform exegesis with a historical, contextual, and lingual study so that you understand the intent, right? Not that you can't get everything that you need with regards to salvation and Christian living from the English Bible, but it certainly seems like that God expects you to be a Berean, right? And look into these things very, very deeply and closely if you are a Christian.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, with that, let's go ahead and take a quick bird's eye view of Matthew 24. I'm gonna
Sure.
kind of go through it um briefly at times, but I think we should at least read more in depth as we get into the middle, right? So Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple. I don't think we need to get into that too much.
No.
I mean, that should be clear. The temple in Jerusalem, as well as the city, was
Yeah, it was
destroyed
destroyed.
in 70 AD, right? So there we already see a prophecy that is past, right? That's pretty um, straightforward. We're gonna look at. I don't know if I want to read this though because we could get really in depth here, and I don't want to get
Well,
caught up
so
too
so
much.
one thing that's worth pointing out is that
Hmm.
there's a separation of subject there. Jesus foretelling the destruction of the temple, and then it
Hmm.
says the signs of the end of the age, as if these are two different conversations. They're not.
Right,
He,
right,
he's
right,
literally continuing the conversation about the destruction of the temple. And so grammatically, we want to look at that and say he's relating the destruction of the temple to his next statements, right? Because
right.
grammatically speaking, that's what he's doing, right?
Right, right,
Yeah.
exactly. And so, you need to kind of tie that with like when he talks about like I don't know which verse it is, like nation rising against
Yeah.
nation and
Yes.
here it is, verse 7, kingdom against kingdom. That's tied to that destruction of that temple, right? Like that what
Right.
is this talking about? There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. From history we can see that that's exactly what happened
Sure.
when Rome sacked Jerusalem, right? So all of these things you can point to history and say, well, you know the destruction of the temple happened by the Roman invasion, basically. It was a nation rising against a nation, a kingdom against a kingdom. There was famines. One of the things that we do see is how terrible, what terrible conditions people were living in at that time, to the point that there are stories of women um, having to eat their own babies. Just
Eat their
just
babies.
really,
Right.
really horrible
Yeah.
stuff that was happening at that time during that war. Um, and so this is the tribulation, right? Like that
Yeah.
that we so often hear about.
Yeah.
Again,
You should
taking that
skip
partial
skip down
preterist.
to skip down to 29, verse
You
29.
don't want to do abomination of the
Oh, we
desolation,
could yeah, we could totally do that.
because you know
Absolutely.
what? I want to start reading here. So I wanted to give kind of like a summary over here, just so like the reader kind of sees what we're getting at and how we're getting to where we're getting. But let's start reading here. I'm going to read it out loud, and then we can go ahead and make all the comments we want. So starting in
Okay.
verse 15, it says, "So
Yeah, let me
when you
just
see
pull
the
it up.
abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Why are those only in Judea if this is a world event, right?
Right.
Why
Right.
are they fleeing to the mountains? And also, if I'm making commentary already, let me keep reading. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back and take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant, for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead you astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And then I will read these through 35, and then that's it. So 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Excuse me, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. All right, that was a lot. I'm sure you have thoughts. Go for it.
Many, many, right? So if you don't mind scrolling back up to the
Absolutely.
abomination of desolation, we should look at that and the prophecies of Daniel, sort of therein, right? And so, in short, for those who are not necessarily familiar with this concept, the abomination of desolation is a man who sets himself up to be God, right? And opposes God and declares himself to be God above all gods. Okay, so there are passages about this happening, and so when we talked about Kaiser Kurios, Caesar is Lord, and that sort of reaching its apex with Nero during this time, what we see is a great tribulation in Judea at that time because of a war, that rebellion that we talked about, right? This is resulting in mass deaths and all kinds of horrific, just horrific circumstances for folks living in Judea at that time. Um, but what we see is Nero claiming to be God, claiming that Caesars are gods, that the emperors are God, and Vespasian, when he comes to destroy the temple in Jerusalem, makes the same statement from the temple.
Hmm.
Okay, that Caesar is in fact Lord. Okay, and so this is the abomination of desolation. Now there was sort of a type of this that happened with a ruler from Syria where he had made an agreement with Jerusalem um, for it's about 7 or 8 years of an agreement, and he came in halfway through, betrayed them, and took many things out of the temple, and did some pretty horrible stuff. That's you won't find that in scripture, but that's a historical happening that you can read about in several places. And so there's a sort of a typification of this kind of thing, right? That we can look to. So when we say the abomination of desolation, we're looking to that kind of thing. A person comes in, they they betray the Judean people that they're supposed to be watching over. They declare themselves God. They declare the rulers of that area God, and they do so in defiance of the living God.
Hmm.
Um, in that in his own temple, right? So that happens in two places: Nero declaring himself God over all things, and Vespasian declaring that Caesar is in fact Lord, that the emperors are gods in the very temple of God before he raises it to the ground. Um, so when we look at the abomination of desolation, many folks would say, well, that hasn't happened. They're looking for like a third temple, and they think that's going to happen at this third temple, and all this kind of stuff like that. But there's a historical event couple of historical events we can look to say, well, that seems to be pretty easily fulfilled, right? And it was
Mhm.
a brutal time. I mean, so many people killed and crucified in
Yeah.
Judea at that time because of the rebellion. And so it definitely fits this description. It is absolutely a genocide, that likely had not been seen until that point in history, right? Um, and what's interesting is, and if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. People think they mean saved as in saved by Jesus. That word in the phrasing there literally just means saved, like alive, like left alive.
Yeah.
It was that bad. It
Yeah.
was really that
Yeah.
bad. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Why? For their sake. If we're going on to eternity from this point, right? Why, for the sake of the elect, will those days be cut short? Well, it's simple. For the sake of the elect means for the sake of the mission the elect have. Okay, that is to spread the gospel and to advance the kingdom of Jesus Christ going forward. Okay, there
Right.
is a mission to be fulfilled, and for that sake, it is cut short. Right, and of course, we see false Christs and false signs and wonders, all those things, and that's, by the way, those kind of things are still happening today. They're typified here, but they happen all the time. We see false Christs and false
Yeah.
messiahs.
So true.
Antichrists is what they were called, um, in the scripture, right? Um, and so we see, Jesus says, "See, I've told you beforehand." If you can scroll down just a little bit, we'll
Yeah.
see sort of the culmination of that passage.
Let me
Um,
see. What one thing I just want to point
yeah,
out, right? Like one of the things. This is going back to verses 15 and 16, right? Jesus is telling Christians to flee to the mountains
right,
if they're in Judea. Uh, and that's very interesting to me because if you have a futurist view, you believe that this abomination of desolation event is going to be a worldwide catastrophe.
right,
It's not going to be this localized event in Israel. But why would Jesus say, "Let those in who are in Judea flee to the mountains" when they see these things happening? It's because it was a local event.
right.
And sure enough, when this whole thing started, there are historical records that confirm that Christians escaped the destruction of Jerusalem because
Yeah,
they knew, because Jesus warned them ahead of time. But I just wanted to make that comment. I'm sorry, you wanted me
yeah,
to scroll down to where?
yeah. No, that's right. Yeah. So if you can scroll down to the end of that passage, um, yeah. So this is a great piece here. It says that his coming will be unmistakable. It says, "For as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." How will you know that he's come?
What verse are you
Well,
looking at? I'm sorry.
27.
20. Oh, I'm
27.
sorry. Okay, gotcha.
Yep.
Go
"For
ahead.
as the
I'm sorry.
lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Um, Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." This is an indication. How will you know he's come? Because there will be dead bodies everywhere. Okay. It will be a war zone. It will look like what he's describing above. It will be a place of absolute desolation because of real, serious physical war.
Mhm.
Um, and so he's giving an indication, look, these are going to be killing fields. You'll know that I've come around because things are going to be pretty dire, right? And so he uses, sort of a, kind of a colloquialism to say, look, when, wherever you see the corpses, that's where the vultures are going to gather. It's unmistakable, right? And so just like that will be coming. When you see this destruction, you'll know that I've come, right? And he is using language from the Old Testament about his coming that doesn't indicate his second coming. Okay, he's using language, a Hebraism from the Old Testament that refers to when God comes to judge a nation, when he comes to a nation. Okay, in the Old Testament prophecies, when he does that, it is often an oracle for that nation's destruction. Okay, um, and so the coming of the Son of Man here should not necessarily be viewed as the second coming. There's not really an indication that that's what's being communicated there, but rather it's more of
Right.
a prophetic approach to the language being used.
Can I show you something real quick that I think is
Yeah,
really, really, really cool? Okay.
sure.
So notice in verse 28 where it says, "Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." Okay.
Right.
Now I want to show you something else. Okay. Where is the share screen? Let me show you in the interlinear Bible how verse 28 is translated. Okay.
Mhm.
You guys can see that right there. Hopefully it's big enough. You have the word "aitoi" to describe vultures.
Right.
Okay, in verse 28. Remember, it says, "There the vultures will gather." But guess what? "Aitoi" means something else too. Let me show you. So you see that I'm not making this up, guys. This is not some weird conspiracy. This is kind of amazing, actually. Um, Wait, here we go. So this is Google Translate. All right, "Aitoi." Look at the translation. Do you see what it
Yeah.
says?
Eagles.
Eagle,
Yeah.
eagles.
Yeah.
Why would the Bible say vultures, but why would the word "aitoi" also mean eagles?
Yeah. I
Do
mean,
you
it's because "Ayatollah" means birds of prey. That's what it really means.
correct,
Yeah,
correct.
falcons, birds of prey.
But do you know what country at that time, what nation at that time was associated with the eagle?
I guess I don't.
It's the Roman Empire.
That
The
makes
ins-
sense. Sure. Yeah.
the insignia of the Romans was the eagle. And so maybe I'm stretching it here, but it's kind of surprising that, or at least very interesting, right? We have to admit that this is very interesting. That it's saying that wherever these corpses are, that's where the vultures or eagles will
Mm,
gather. So,
yeah.
hey, maybe I'm reading too much into it. Um, I looked into this myself. I had heard it. Maybe I think it was Jeff Durbin that pointed that out, and I
Mhm.
said I got to look into this myself because that sounds crazy to me.
Yeah, I mean, I
Um,
would need to look into that, but it certainly seems to make sense to me.
s-
Right.
so that was kind of amazing. But even if it's not eagles, at the end of the day, I still think you're making a great point that this is going to be chaotic, right? Like
Yeah.
that's where these birds of
Well, and
prey.
we shouldn't remove the possibility that vultures is an epithet, right?
Right, right.
For people who represent themselves as eagles, right? You're not really eagles, you're vultures because the one who's doing this is the Lord, and you're
Hmm.
just coming to sort of do his bidding and clean up the mess, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
I'd have to look into it more, but that is an interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you want to keep going?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
So 29 is one of my favorite parts, right? Matthew 24:29. This is not up for debate. This is Isaiah 13, right? That's what this is. It's Isaiah 13. And if you look at Isaiah 13, okay, Isaiah 13 is an oracle against Babylon, okay?
Hmm.
It's an oracle against Babylon. Weird, because the epithetical way that Jerusalem is referred to later in the scriptures is as Babylon, okay? It's whoring around with all these nations, just like Babylon did, okay? So we have an oracle of the destruction of Babylon being quoted here by Jesus, okay? Now, in the Oracle of Babylon, this same decreation language is used. It actually uses the stars and the word constellations, but it's the same. It's a similar. It's a similar statement. Okay, the formation of the statement is exactly the same. So when it talks about the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling from heaven, the powers of heavens will be shaken. This is figurative language from Isaiah 13 that was to describe the greatness of the fall of Babylon.
Yeah.
It was going to be a massive fall. The universe was going to fall down around their ears. That's what it was going to feel like, right? For them, it was going to feel like the sun fell from the sky, the moon fell from the sky, the stars fell from the sky. Okay, that everything went totally dark, that there was no light, that the very powers of the heavens were shaken. This is metaphoric language for Jesus saying, "I'm going to put your lights out." Right?
Yeah.
We can
Brutal.
yeah, and by the way, a common language for Jesus to use when he talks about doing something, what does he say about the churches in Revelation? I'm going to remove your light. I'm going to
Hmm.
remove your light
It's
if you
judgment.
don't do these things. This is judgment.
Yeah.
Okay. He says, I'm gonna put your lights out. I'm gonna take you out. This is talking about Jerusalem.
Yeah.
This is talking about Jerusalem, and it's referring to it in the same way that the Old Testament referred to this to the destruction of Babylon. This is, I don't care if you're a premillennial, amillennial, I don't care. This is not up for debate. This is what this is. This is what this is. It's what it's quoting, and that is not up for interpretation.
But
And
what do you say that this is talking, and maybe I'm playing devil's advocate here, but what do you say this is talking about the return of Christ, right? The second advent?
well, there's no indication that he has changed from the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple to his second coming, right? Remember, when we talk about the coming of the Son of Man, there's no indicative part of that statement that says that that's his second coming, right? But rather that it's just him coming around, the same way that God would come and visit a nation in the Old Testament for judgment, okay? And so he doesn't change the subject on which he's speaking, right? He's still speaking, you know, to the same effect, right? He's answering the disciples' question, right? He says, all these temples are all the buildings in the temple, all these stones are going to be thrown down.
Hmm.
And they go, when's that going to happen? How's that going to happen? This is him answering the question,
Right.
right? He's just answering it long form.
Right.
Just
Right.
because just because he's being detailed doesn't mean that he's changing subjects in the middle of the statement. Instead, what he's doing is giving them a clear indication of exactly what they can expect, right? What's fantastic here is he goes on to again reference Daniel. He says, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all tribes on the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and glory. Well, that's Daniel 7.
Yeah.
Well, the problem with attributing that to his second coming is that Daniel 7, the coming on the clouds of heaven with power and glory, is to the Ancient of Days. It's not to the earth.
Hmm.
He's going to the Ancient of Days. This is talking about his ascension. Okay. This is talking about his ascension. And so what he's saying is they're going to see me ascend publicly, which did happen, by the way.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Okay. They're going to see that sign. I'm going to ascend. I'm going to go on the clouds of heaven with power and glory to the Ancient of Days. And what does he do when he goes to the Ancient of Days? He inherits the kingdom,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
He inherits the kingdom at
Yeah.
that time. He says this, he's going to send out his angels with a loud trumpet call. They'll gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And for some reason, we think that's some fantastical event. And this is talking about building his church. This
Right.
is talking
Right.
about building his kingdom. People coming from all nations, right? All of the four winds. And he's going to gather them from one end of heaven to the other, right? And that is the culmination and the fullness of his church over the course of time.
Right.
Um,
One
mhm,
key thing that we have to keep in mind is when it says he will send out his angels, right?
right.
What is the
Messengers. Angelos.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly,
angelos.
right? I think sometimes we have to keep in mind um, the word angel. What it actually is supposed to mean is messenger, right?
Yeah,
And so when it says he will send out his angels, you could say there he will send out his messengers with a loud
yeah,
trumpet call.
yeah. At that time, the word apostolos was not used in that capacity. So angelos really here, messengers is likely the better interpretation of that passage.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add here, or do should we go to the last few
No, let's
verses?
go to the last one.
All right,
Um,
32 to
yeah, I
35.
mean, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer's near. He's saying, just look, I'm telling you that when you see these things happen, know that it's near. By the way, why would he say to people who were standing in front of him, when you see these
Right,
things happen,
right,
know that this is near? You're going to see it happen,
correct.
right? So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. This is
Right,
besieging language. This is the language of God coming to make war on a nation.
Yeah.
Okay. He
It's
is
not
at the
2000
gates.
plus years from when he's saying it.
Correct. He's near. He's at the gates. At the gates with what? Siege works.
Hmm.
This is a war statement. Okay.
Right.
He says, "Truly I say to you, this
Yeah.
generation will not pass away until all these things take place." He was right about that
Yeah.
because the destruction of the temple happened in 70 AD,
Right.
which
Right.
was really less than a
For
generation.
40,
Right.
30 something years after
Yeah.
he said it, it happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Right in that generation. And he says this, heaven and earth will pass away. My words will not pass away. This is a separate statement. And for some reason, we have the habit of trying to tie it to everything else that he says. And he says, well, heaven and earth is going to pass away when all this stuff happens. No, this is a capstone statement,
Right.
right? To the idea that he's presenting.
Hmm.
He's saying, look, heaven and earth will pass away. My words will not pass away. What he's giving is a guarantee.
Right.
He's saying,
Exactly.
look, this is guaranteed to come to pass exactly as I have said it will. And we can look in the history books and know that really it did.
Yeah.
Right? It was pretty specific, really specific, actually, um, and fit this exact motif. And indeed, that generation did not pass away until all those things took place. And it was the coming of the end of the age. What age? Well, in the church, we view ages by covenant, right? We view ages
Hmm.
by covenant.
Yeah.
The end of what age? The end of the Judaic age in regards to the Mosaic covenant and the establishment in finality of the new covenant, right? As God's kingdom on earth, his kingdom of priests on earth. That is why the temple's destroyed. That's why it's sacked. The genealogies are lost. That's one thing that a lot of people don't know about that time. But the Jewish genealogies are lost at that time. Um, and there is a great deal of destruction that happens over the course of those few years, right?
Yeah.
Where there was really this horrible backlash because of the Jewish revolt against Rome. And so um, this is, again, we want to take these statements logically as they're written sequentially, right? He's giving a sequential order of things, and he's using language that folks would recognize as that at that time to understand sort of prophecy about destruction, about what it looks like for God to visit a nation in judgment, right? And then very clear language about when it's going to happen, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, man, this I think about does it. This was fantastic, and I appreciate your breakdown because you are, the way that you explain things. I'm gonna have you. You're probably gonna take over my show one day because um, that was fantastic. Thank you very much for being here. And yeah, man.
Sorry for all the yelling. I realized I was yelling. I'm like, why am I being so loud?
You were yelling?
Um, I guess so.
No, I don't think you were yelling.
Okay, it felt like I was being really
Listen,
loud.
I live in Miami, okay? I live amongst Cubans, okay? They call Cubans, some people address Cubans as the Italians of Latin America, okay? So you don't know what yelling is, my friend.
Yeah, listen, an amateur in that regard. Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, man, this was great. This was awesome, and thank you very much for your feedback, your expertise. You have a way of explaining things that is just fantastic. I think this is hopefully if you guys stuck around and made it to the end, that was the best part for me when we actually broke down parts of Matthew 24. So hopefully this has been a blessing to you guys. Bill, thanks for being here. Thanks for helping me out here. And guys, if you liked it, give it a like. If you have any backlash or any responses, I'm sure there will be some. You can always let us know in the comments. Until next time, God bless you guys. Take care.
God bless.